The Russian Federation is the current successor in a long line of empires and confederacies that dominated the land known as the Eurasian Steppe. This vast region is unique in world geography, spanning from the eastern end of Siberia, bordering the Atlantic coast, all the way to Europe in the west. What defines this land is in fact its lack of definition. Almost entirely flat, very few mountains, and no massive rivers carving up the land and dividing it into different regions. What you have is an endless expanse of what could be best described as nothingness, whether that be the Siberian tundra or rolling grasslands that go on as far as the eye can see. Such a geographical landscape is quite unique if you compare it with other regions in the world, where countries are very much defined by their geographical boundaries. This is frequently the case with mountains, rivers, oceans, or even dense rainforest or jungle. In lands hemmed in on all sides by borders, you're most likely to find established civilizations where people settle down on the land and decide to stake their claim as there's nowhere left to go. Take China for instance. Bounded on all sides, to the south you have the dense jungle of Southeast Asia, the Pacific Ocean to the east, the Tibetan Plateau to the west, and to the north, the aforementioned vast expanse of nothingness. However, as we know, this expanse of nothingness isn't completely devoid. There are people there. However, the people that exist in this abyss are a little different from the people that live in the settled zones. Due to the extreme climate, agriculture is much less feasible, and instead, people there rely on a nomadic existence. What this region is abundant in though is grass, lots of it, as far as the eye can see. This allows the people there to have large herds of animals without worrying about overgrazing. With the help of the horse, which had readily available access to grass, the nomads could maintain a large portable food source, ultimately giving them accessibility to the landscape in the same way boats would have provided accessibility to sailors on the Mediterranean Sea. This is what allowed this vast terrain to be inhabited by the humans that live there. Contrast this with the peoples of settled civilizations, like in China, where farmers would stay on their land, invest in their land, pass the land down to their children, defend the land against others who would try and take it away from them, and if enough of these farmers felt threatened, they would band together to collectively fight a common threat to their settled area, because at the end of the day, because of their lifestyle, there is simply nowhere else left for them to go. If they lose their land, they lose their way of life and their ability to survive. This dichotomy between settled civilizations and nomadic peoples is a conflict that stretches back to the dawn of time. Two distinctly different people whose lives run parallel to each other. Their entire culture, way of life, belief system, attitudes, social and political structures are completely different owing to the different niches they operate in. Based on those core differences between them, the war between settled peoples and nomadic peoples is an ancient story that is echoed on until the Industrial Revolution, where one group gains at the expense of the other. Although industrialized Western civilization completely crushed the lifestyles in the modern era, the verdict on whether one way of life was superior to the other was an unsettled matter throughout most of human time. Case in point, the largest empires in human history dominated the Eurasian landmass, which is the largest landmass in the world. Up until Russia's conquest of it, Eurasia had been solely dominated by fierce nomadic warrior tribes and the confederations they formed. The civilizations of settled lands simply could not dominate Eurasia the same way that the nomadic groups could. To live in these lands required hyper-specialization into horseback riding, animal husbandry, horse archery, hunting, and most importantly, war. For most of human history, the standing armies of settled civilizations were made up of off-duty farmers whose specialization was cultivating the fields. In contrast, those who lived on the Eurasian steppe were riding horses since they were 3 years old, shooting birds with bows and arrows since they were 5, and most importantly, war was a way of life for these people. If they weren't fighting with each other, much of their focus was designated to plundering their old, ancient, ancestral rivals, the people of settled civilizations. From here, we have a context of how the Xiongnu emerged from the primordial soup. The first and legendary dynasty of China, known as the Xia, occupied a parcel of land that is commonly referred to as the Central Plain. This is a parcel of land that exists around the Yellow River, consisting of Hebei and Henan, whose names both mean south of the river and north of the river. The founding emperor, Yu the Great, made his claim to fame by taming this unpredictable river, building a dam, and with the explosion of agricultural productivity, Chinese civilization would make its way onto the scene as more and more people found it a better way of life to settle in the land and engage in agriculture. With a surplus of food from agriculture, more people were freed up to specialize in the other activities which would allow for the building of cosmopolitan civilization. The people that lived in this civilization began to naturally view themselves as completely different from those that lived outside of the civilization, who still had a more primordial existence. The most obvious and crass difference was the fact that the people in the civilization wore clothes. Not just rags of rabbit fur or donkey hair, but beautiful clothes with dyed colors, patterns woven into them, made out of unique materials like silk. This stood in great contrast to the people of outside this civilization, who were draped in animal hides, or in many cases were bare-chested, or even possibly naked. These beautifully clothed people were called Huaxia. Hua meaning beautiful, and Xia means clothes. From this primordial time up until now, Chinese people are referred to Huaxia people, beautifully clothed people, a distinction from people outside the civilization who didn't have beautiful clothes. In fact, they were so uncivilized that they didn't even shave their beards. These bearded people were known as Hu. Hu means beard, and it was these unclothed, bearded Hu people who were referred to as barbarians. So you have the land of the beautifully clothed people and the land of the bearded barbarian people, and this would be an ideological dichotomy that would last for 4,000 years of Chinese imperial rule, with each successive dynasty dominating more and more fertile land at the expense of the barbarians. The bearded people would be forced further and further away from their original homelands. To the north, there were many such groups that were pushed out of their original place of origin, and amongst them were the ancestors of the Xiongnu. The ancestors of the Xiongnu originally resided in what was known as the Ordos Plateau, but were over time driven into the Gobi Desert in Inner Mongolia. Despite this constant encroachment on their lands, they in turn would be a persistent source of anxiety for the beautifully clothed people, raiding and pillaging their lands. However, the most extreme example of this is when the bearded barbarian Trenrong tribe sacked the capital of Western Zhou in 1771 BC, ending that dynasty's 250-year reign. According to Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, the Xiongnu were founded by a leader named Tumen in 220 BC, would have no doubt been a confederacy of many different nomadic tribes that existed in the area and can't be thought of as a distinctly homogeneous ethnic group. Just like the many pejorative terms used to describe such barbarians, the Xiongnu's name was no less flattering, with the character Xiong meaning fierce and the character Nu meaning slave. However, the tribal confederacy of these so-called fierce slaves would become the most powerful, prominent, and politically stable confederacy out of all the tribes that had come before it. When China finally became united after the Warring States in 221 BC, Emperor Qin Shi Huang would institute the building of the Great Wall of China to keep these savage warriors from continuously making incursions into their land. However, with the fall of the Qin dynasty only 11 years later, the Xiongnu would effortlessly expand in all directions, spreading westwards by conquering the other tribal factions in Eurasia and reconquering their ancestral homeland in the Ordos Plateau. By the time the Han rose to power in China, the Xiongnu were an unstoppable force. Case in point, they were able to muster a 320,000 strong army and besiege the first Han Dynasty Emperor Liu Bang, almost dethroning him and prematurely ending China's most illustrious golden era. But unlike wars between two settled civilizations, the goal of tribal confederacies like the Xiongnu was rarely ever to permanently take the lands they had conquered and settle on it themselves. Their only goal was to extract tribute and ransom from the conquered peoples and repeat the cycle a little while later. This would define their relationship with the Han Dynasty, constantly going to war with them, raiding their lands, all for the sake of getting paid to leave. It's from these ransoms and tributes that the Xiongnu continue to grow in power and wealth, and it's for this reason that the power of the Xiongnu ebbed and flowed with the prosperity of China. The richer and more powerful their neighbors got, the more rich and powerful they themselves got. This is in great contrast when it came to war with other people groups of the nomadic steppe, where the goal of warfare tended to be completely different. Join us or die would have been their motto. Besieging the Han Emperor and receiving tribute would have been considered merciful compared to what they would do to their contemporary rivals, such as the Yuezhi people. Prior to the Xiongnu, the land of the Hershey Corridor and the Tarim Basin was occupied by an Indo-European people known as the Yuezhi, according to Chinese sources. These are the same Indo-Europeans responsible for the blue-eyed, blonde-haired mummies found in the region. However, after the Xiongnu, the Yuezhi were completely scrubbed from history, never to be heard from again. The Xiongnu are considered to be ancestors of the Mongols, but at the same time, they were very much ethnically Turkic. So the sweeping of the Xiongnu over the Eurasian steppe would paint the land with Turkic and Mongolic genetics. By 174 BC, the Xiongnu were recognized as the dominant tribal people bordering the Chinese Han Empire. Although they were still considered savage barbarians, they'd earned the fear and respect of the beautifully clothed people, with Chinese envoys being forced to adhere to their customs, such as getting facial tattoos in order to be given entry into Xiongnu territory. In 200 BC, Emperor Liu Bang of Han launched a counter-offensive against the Xiongnu after the provincial capital of Taiyuan was laid to siege. However, in the Battle of Baideng, he was ambushed by Xiongnu cavalry and was almost killed by them, left to wander in the wilderness, isolated for a whole 7 days. It was around this time that the Chinese started to develop specialized tactics to deal with these northern barbarians. The most common tactic, of course, was bribing them, but if they were forced to fight, they would hire Xiongnu warriors or other steppe nomadic people to do the fighting for them. Perhaps they would also financially support rival clans or tribes that would destabilize Xiongnu power from within. The tactic that the Han would have the most success with, though, is the implementation of marriage diplomacy. It's not uncommon throughout Chinese history for an emperor to marry off one of his daughters to an enemy of his to seal a peace agreement. But what Liu Bang did after his defeat in 200 BC was that he would send unrelated commoner women, falsely labeled as princesses, to Xiongnu leaders to placate them and give them a sense of unity with the Han Chinese. This would cement a lifetime's worth of peace for those who lived at such a time, but after 60 years, when those politically arranged couples would eventually die, the old rivalries would naturally resume. In 133 BC, Emperor Wu of Han prepared for war against the Xiongnu, dispatching explorer Zheng Qian to form an alliance with the remaining Yuezhi people. Although this military campaign was unsuccessful, the Han dynasty's determination to counter the Xiongnu erupted into full-scale war in 129 BC. The Han used the Northern Silk Road for a large-scale campaign, one of the most adventurous military campaigns in Chinese history up until that point. The land beyond the Silk Road was a complete mystery, and knowledge about its existence only existed in fantastical myths and legends, like what's been illustrated in books like Journey to the West. Despite the logistical challenges, the Han achieved significant victories, including retaking the Ordos Plateau back from the Xiongnu and forcing them to relocate to the Gobi Desert in 119 BC. In 104 BC, the Han continued their campaign through the Tarim Basin and ventured into a completely different universe and ended up fighting an entirely different enemy. In the War of Heavenly Horses, Chinese forces fought the Greco-Bactrian state known as Dayuan. These were remnant forces of Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire who had settled in the lands of Uzbekistan. The conquest of this lush area, known as the Fergana Valley, allowed China to acquire a prestigious horse breed that would help them become a peer competitor to the formidable horsemen of the Xiongnu, as prior Chinese horses were considered far inferior to their northern barbarian counterparts. These victories weakened the Xiongnu, making them no longer a significant threat to the Han Empire. By 53 BC, the Xiongnu entered into tributary relations with Han China, making a shift in political status from that of respected rival to that of an outer vassal state. The terms included personal homage, sending a hostage prince, and presenting tribute. The Xiongnu would see a temporary resurgence hundreds of years later during the chaotic period during the 16 Kingdoms era, 304 to 439 AD, with the whole north of China being totally occupied by different barbarian groups. Key among them were the Xiongnu, who controlled 3 of these kingdoms. However, as is always the case with barbarian nomadic warriors settling on conquered lands, they would be assimilated into China and hence vanish from world history, but their ghosts would later re-emerge through their great-grandchildren, the Mongols. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you next time.